Imagine this. It's 1915. The lights dim in a packed theater, the projector hums, and on the screen appears an image of white-robed riders galloping across a battlefield, crosses blazing behind them. The audience gasps, cheers, and applauds. It's the birth of a nation, a film unlike anything ever made before, an epic that would change not only the future of cinema, but also the future of race relations in America. Hailed as a masterpiece, it was celebrated for its innovation in editing, camera movement, and storytelling. But underneath its cinematic beauty was something horrifying. It depicted black men, many played by white actors in blackface, as dangerous brutes, predators, and fools. It portrayed slavery as a benevolent institution and the Ku Klux Klan as America's righteous heroes. Critics and politicians praised it as art. President Woodrow Wilson allegedly called it history written with lightning. But for millions of black Americans, it was lightning that burned everything in its path. The movie didn't just reflect racism, it reignited it. Across the South, lynchings increased. Across the North, theaters became sites of protest and violence. This was propaganda disguised as entertainment, history rewritten through a white lens, and it became one of the most popular films of all time. But even as white audiences celebrated Griffith's vision, another story was being written in the shadows. A generation of black visionaries watched this same film and refused to accept the image it projected of their people. They decided to fight back, not with riots or protests, but with storytelling, with cameras, with light and shadow. They would build their own studios, craft their own scripts, and tell their own truth. These were the first black filmmakers of America, men and women who saw film not as entertainment, but as liberation. They turned the very tool used to oppress them into a weapon of resistance. So here's the question. How did these forgotten pioneers, artists without resources, facing censorship, racism, and violence, manage to build an entire cinematic world of their own? How did they rewrite the story of Black America when Hollywood was determined to erase it? And why have their names, Oscar Micheaux, Noble Johnson, Tressie Soders, and so many others, been almost completely left out of the textbooks? Tonight, we bring their stories back to life. To understand the defiance of the early black filmmakers, we first have to understand the monster they were confronting. When The Birth of a Nation premiered in 1915, it wasn't just another film. It was an event. It was screened for Congress, shown in the White House, and praised by newspapers as a national treasure. Griffith's film claimed to depict the Civil War and Reconstruction, but what it really offered was a fantasy, an alternate history where the Confederacy was noble, slavery was justified, and the Klan rose as a force of moral redemption. White audiences left theaters feeling vindicated, and many took that vindication to the streets across the country. Race riots followed in its wake. In Atlanta, new Klan chapters formed almost overnight. It was, in every sense, a cinematic declaration of white supremacy. And yet something else happened in response, something extraordinary. Outraged and determined, African-American leaders and artists recognized that if film could shape the public mind, it could also reshape it. Black newspapers called for independent productions that would show the truth about black life. Church groups, educators, and business leaders began pooling resources to create what they called race films, movies made by black people, for black audiences, showing black humanity. These films weren't backed by Hollywood. They were produced in church basements, school auditoriums, and rented warehouses. But what they lacked in funding, they made up for in purpose. Each film was a rebuttal to the lies of Griffith's America. The filmmakers behind them weren't just entertainers. They were historians, journalists, philosophers. They understood that a nation's memory is shaped by what it sees, so they decided to show something new. Between 1910 and 1930, black-owned production companies began to appear across the country, from Chicago and Kansas City to New York, Philadelphia, and Jacksonville, Florida. Their stories were diverse: love, ambition, religion, tragedy, and triumph. But beneath them all ran a single theme: resistance. Leading this cinematic revolution was a man named Oscar Micheaux, often called the godfather of African-American film. Born in 1884 in Metropolis, Illinois, the son of formerly enslaved parents, Micheaux grew up poor but ambitious. He became a homesteader in South Dakota, one of the few black settlers on the Great Plains. Out there, under endless skies, he began writing novels about self-determination, race, and survival. His life was hard, his worldview sharp, and his words carried the weight of a man who had built something from nothing. When the birth of a nation took the country by storm, Micheaux saw clearly that countering it in words wasn't enough. The battle had moved to the screen. So he founded the Micheaux Film and Book Company, and with only a few $100s, he produced The Homesteader in 1919, the first full-length film ever directed by an African American. It told the story of a black man's search for independence in a segregated society and mirrored Micheaux's own life. It was sold through mail order, screened in community halls, and became a sensation in black communities. But it was his second film, Within Our Gates, 1920, that made him a legend. That film was more than art. It was an act of defiance. In one harrowing sequence, a white mob lynches a black man, while a white landowner attempts to assault a black woman, a deliberate reversal of the false black beast imagery in Griffith's work. The film exposed the brutal reality of lynching and systemic racism, showing audiences truths that white Hollywood would never touch. It was so honest, in fact, that censors in Chicago and other cities tried to ban it, claiming it might provoke racial unrest. But Micheaux refused to cut the scenes. He believed that art should tell the truth, no matter how uncomfortable. Around the same time, Brothers Noble and George Johnson founded the Lincoln Motion Picture Company in Los Angeles. Noble, a successful actor who would later appear in major Hollywood films, understood that representation was more than visibility. It was dignity. The company's mission was to show the better side of Negro life. Their debut film, The Realization of a Negro's Ambition, 1916, told the story of a black engineer who discovers oil and becomes successful, a symbol of black innovation and enterprise. The message was simple, but radical. We are more than what you think we are. These were the pioneers. They built cameras when no one would lend them. They cast their neighbors, relatives, and church friends. They filmed in borrowed rooms and dusty fields, but their vision was crystal clear. If America wouldn't show the truth, they would create it themselves. By the early 1920s, the race film industry had become a national phenomenon. Dozens of studios sprouted up, most of them small, independent, and run on shoestring budgets. William Foster, one of the earliest black directors, had already made The Pullman Porter in 1912, a comedy short about everyday working-class black life that many historians now recognize as the first narrative film directed by an African-American. Foster declared that race films were more than entertainment. They were a tool for collective pride. Across the country, Audiences gathered in segregated theaters, community centers, and churches to watch these films. They saw themselves on screen for the first time, laughing, falling in love, running businesses, solving mysteries. This new form of cinema created a mirror where there had only been distortion. There were over 600 race theaters operating across America by the mid-1920s, creating a parallel cinematic universe entirely independent of Hollywood. The Lincoln Motion Picture Company, Real Productions, Ebony Film Corporation, and Micheaux's own studio were producing dramas, comedies, and romances. Films like The Flames of Wrath, 1923, by Maria P. Williams, the first film written, produced, and directed by a black woman, proved that women were also shaping the narrative. Black newspapers advertised these films with pride, calling them a new form of racial uplift. It wasn't just art, it was economics, culture, and identity wrapped together. The race film circuit employed hundreds of actors, technicians, and writers. It gave rise to stars like Evelyn Prier, Clarence Brooks, and Spencer Williams, who became household names in black communities. In many ways, these films laid the groundwork for the Harlem Renaissance, fueling a cultural confidence that spilled over into literature, music, and theater. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about this movement was how self-sufficient it was. Black filmmakers didn't need Hollywood's permission. They built their own distribution networks. They carried film reels across state lines, rented projectors, and created their own promotional circuits. In an America built on segregation, they created a separate, thriving cinematic ecosystem. Success brought attention, and attention brought resistance. White-run censorship boards in cities like Chicago, Atlanta, and New Orleans began targeting race films for inciting racial tension. Scenes of black soldiers, successful businessmen, or interracial respect were routinely censored or banned. Micheaux's Within Our Gates was nearly lost to history because it was deemed too provocative. It dared to show truth, and yet despite every barrier, these filmmakers continued. Micheaux alone produced more than 40 films over 3 decades. His work evolved with the times, from silent dramas to talking pictures, from moral tales to social thrillers. But as the 1930s arrived, the world changed. The Great Depression devastated independent businesses, and the arrival of sound film required expensive new technology that most black studios couldn't afford. Hollywood, meanwhile, began to adopt and exploit race film aesthetics, producing sanitized versions of black stories that stripped them of meaning while cashing in on the novelty. Still, the work had left its mark. The first black filmmakers had created a foundation, a model for independence that future generations would follow. Spencer Williams, who started as an actor in Micheaux's films, went on to direct The Blood of Jesus, 1941, one of the most influential religious films in American cinema. It played in churches for decades and remains a spiritual masterpiece. But while the artists kept creating, history was not kind to them. As time passed, film reels deteriorated, studios folded, archives refused to preserve black films. Out of the hundreds of movies produced during the race film era, only a fraction survive today. Many were destroyed deliberately, others were simply forgotten. Hollywood histories written in the mid-20th century barely mentioned Micheaux or his peers, erasing them from the national narrative. Their legacy became a whisper, a memory buried beneath reels of propaganda. And yet, history has a way of resurfacing. In the late 20th century, historians and archivists began uncovering these forgotten films, often in astonishing places: attics, basements, even garbage bins. When Within Our Gates was rediscovered and restored in the 1990s, it was nothing short of a revelation. Film scholars realized they were looking at the earliest surviving feature by an African-American director, a direct response to the most racist film in American history. Watching it felt like watching a ghost come back to life. The same is true for Body and Soul, 1925, another Micheaux film which featured a young Paul Robeson in his screen debut. These restorations proved that the first black filmmakers weren't marginal. They were essential. Their influence can be seen everywhere. Gordon Parks, who directed The Learning Tree in 1969 and later Shaft, 1971, built upon Micheaux's foundation of self-determination. Melvin Van Peebles, Julie Dash, Spike Lee, Ava DuVernay all stand in the lineage of the race film pioneers. They inherited not just a craft, but a calling, to tell the truth that others will not tell. Even in mainstream Hollywood, echoes of their struggle remain. Every time a film like Get Out, Moonlight, or Selma reframes American identity through a black lens, it's continuing the battle those first filmmakers began more than a century ago. The race film movement proved that cinema is not neutral. It is political, emotional, and transformative. The camera, when held by those denied the right to be seen, becomes an act of rebellion. These early filmmakers understood that deeply. They knew that the power to create images was the power to define reality. And in doing so, they gave generations of African Americans permission to see themselves not as others defined them, but as they truly were. So, what do we make of this story now? More than 100 years later, the pioneers who built America's first black film industry are still largely unknown to the public. Their films remain hard to find, their names missing from film school curricula. But their fingerprints are everywhere, in every independent film that challenges authority, in every artist who refuses to wait for permission to create. They showed that cinema could be a tool for liberation, long before the rest of the world caught up. They proved that storytelling could reclaim history itself. When we talk about the history of film, we shouldn't just celebrate Hollywood's golden age. We should honor the filmmakers who, against all odds, created a golden age of their own. These were visionaries who used the most powerful medium of their time to fight back against a world built to silence them. They transformed the screen from a mirror of oppression into a window of possibility. So the next time you sit in a darkened theater, remember that the light flickering on the screen was once carried by hands that the world tried to erase. It was carried by Oscar Micheaux, Noble Johnson, Tressie Souders, William Foster, Maria Williams, and countless others. They were the first to show that history isn't just something we inherit, it's something we create. Their stories remind us that to control the narrative is to control the future. What did you think about today's video? Comment your thoughts and suggestions for my next video below. And remember, the story of America isn't just written in textbooks, it's projected in light, preserved in film, and carried in the hearts of those who dared to see themselves and the world through their own lens.